I'm sure most of you are really familiar with Natasha already and the content that she talks about. And I felt that it would be really worthwhile for us to use this as a learning opportunity to go into a bit more detail and ask the questions that many of you may have about the legal questions and the legal accusations, the blood libels, as Natasha called the genocide accusation, that are being leveled at Israel in quite a shocking and appalling way. And there's so many things to talk about. And I also really encourage you to ask your questions. There's a Q&A chat where you can type your questions, and we'll get to those when we're about maybe 40 minutes into the interview. But Natasha, before getting into some of the legal questions, I just want to touch on something recently that occurred, which is that you went to speak at the Oxford Union. The debate was about this. The proposition was that saying Israel is an apartheid state guilty of committing genocide. And there, for those who weren't familiar, Mossab Hassan Youssef, the son of a Hamas co-founder and leader who is a great ally of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, asked the audience in the room if they would have reported, if they knew, had prior warning about what Hamas would plan to do on October 7th, would they have reported it to the Israeli authorities? And it seemed like around only 5% put their hands would report it. Natasha, could you just spend a few minutes just reflecting on your experience being there? What kind of audience was this? And were you particularly alarmed, as I think many of us were?
Well, Ollie, thank you very much for the opportunity to address this. I think it was a stroke of genius by Mossab to pose this question to the participants, the members of the Oxford Union who had attended for this debate, because it put into stark relief the way that this audience had, it seemed, been stacked on one side of the debate. I mean, that was apparent to us from the moment we walked into the chamber, that myself and my co-speakers on the opposition were subject to boos and jeers. One of the proposition speakers, they'd actually been admitted into the chamber before us, quite substantially in advance of us, I think, had written on social media that they had walked into a standing ovation, whoops and cheers, and certainly that was setting the scene for the way that the rest of the debate went and the audience's responses to each of the speeches in turn. But Mossab's question to the audience put into stark relief, essentially, that the enormous majority of support that existed in that once illustrious debating chamber for the atrocities of the 7th of October perpetrated by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other Palestinian terrorist organizations. And he was in a I'd say unique position to do so, because it came on the back of his own story, which is that he turned informer in order to save the lives of Israelis, because he knew in advance about suicide bombings that had been planned by the organization Hamas that his father headed up. Hence the byline "son of Hamas," and I would advocate his book, The Green Prince, which chronicles his experiences as growing up as the son of this Hamas commander. His experience is also in an Israeli prison, of seeing how the Hamas leadership within that prison tortured other Palestinians, and of then turning informant, and his experiences in essentially working as an asset for Mossad. Or in fact, the Shin Bet, given the authorities that operate around the West Bank, which is where he grew up in Ramallah. One other important aspect, I think, of the evening, which probably hasn't been picked up by media, is the virulent abuse that my two Arab partners were subject to. From the moment that we walked into that chamber, an abuse in Arabic, which again is pretty strongly indicative of the makeup of the audience in that chamber, that so many of them were draped in kaffirs and were screaming these threats and insults in Arabic to the two Arabs that were speaking on my side of the motion. We had Mossab. We also had Yusuf Haddad, an Israeli Arab who's extremely outspoken. And I think it sits so ill with the identity politics of those at universities across the country, across the United States, and much, I would say, of the Western world, but it seems especially at elite institutions like the University of Oxford and the Oxford Union, it sits so ill with the identity politics of these individuals that there would be two Arabs speaking up on behalf of the State of Israel against such a disgraceful motion. You mentioned the wording of the motion, that Israel is an apartheid state responsible for genocide. That was, in fact, the slightly softened version. The first version that I was invited to debate was that Israel ought to be subject to sanctions and divestment as a result of its apartheid and genocide. So that gives you perhaps a flavour of what it is that the president, himself from Egypt, was seeking to achieve with this evening. I'm very glad that the extreme behaviour, including breaking the law, as Miko Peled, when he called, this is a speaker on the proposition side, he is shamefully an Israeli who has, it seems, turned his back both on his country but also on reality, given what he was propagating in the course of this debate. But he also voiced support for Hamas, contrary to Section 12(1)(a) of the Terrorism Act 2000, when he called the 7th of October attacks heroic. That has been edited out of his speech that the union has put out on its YouTube account. And certainly it's been reported in national media that the counter-terrorism police are investigating and may, in fact, have been looking for Miko Peled while he still remained in the country. So it's important, I would just perhaps finish by saying this, the media coverage and the furore and the fact that this was mentioned only a couple of days ago in Parliament, it is important that this has now finally come out into the open, because this was the culmination of a term under this President of the Union, which comprised virulently anti-Israel, anti-Semitic speakers who were given platform after platform without challenge. And one example, and I dipped into some of the content on the YouTube channel in advance of the debate, one example is the PLO representative here in the United Kingdom, Hossam Zumlot, who was interviewed and, amongst other things, continued to misrepresent the International Court of Justice Provisional Measures Order, which I'm sure we'll come on to in due course when we dissect the international legal matters. But when he did continue to misrepresent international law and the determinations, provisional measures of international courts and tribunals, he was left entirely unchallenged. And that, I'm afraid, is reflective of what so many of these elite institutions have fallen into, to be propaganda mouths, propaganda platforms for Hamas, for Islamic extremism, Islamism, for Qatar. Many of them are funded by. And if this debacle on the 28th of November has caused the international media to take greater note of what is going on, and no doubt caused the university authorities concern, donors to the Oxford Union concern, then I think it's a jolly good thing that Jonathan Sacherdoti, myself, Yusuf Haddad, and Mossab Hassan Yusuf participated in it, because it is important that we hold the line on the truth, push back against the misrepresentations, and ensure that the general public is made aware of what is going on in these otherwise relatively closed, elite, closeted places.
Absolutely, and you showed so much courage speaking in such a hostile room. It's amazing to see, and I highly encourage everyone to watch Natasha's full speech at the Oxford Union. I'm curious though, 95% of the room said they wouldn't have reported Hamas to the authorities. Do you have a sense in which the makeup of the audience is representative or not so representative of the wider Oxford student body?
So it's relatively difficult for me to assess that, because it's been over a decade since I was at Oxford myself, and I certainly felt, as an active participant at the Oxford Union when I was there, I certainly felt that things had changed substantially, both at the dinner that was hosted before the event, in which we were also pretty appallingly treated by the University Oxford Union team, president's team, but then also in terms of the composition in the chamber. I had been informed that Jewish students felt far too intimidated to attend. So within that, there's an indication that the audience was somewhat self-selecting, of those simply in favour of this grotesque motion. The anti-Israel presence, and as I say, was palpable both from the costumes that were being donned by much of this room. Many, I'd say the vast majority of those attending perhaps wearing kaffirs, but also because, as I was also informed, that some students were turned away, not because the union chamber was full, but because it seemed that some students and indeed non-students, I think it's Honest Reporting that's done some analysis through photo recognition of some of the members of the audience and indicated that some of them are hardcore anti-Israel activists who have pretty appalling social media track records, praising the 7th of October and engaging in what may in fact in many respects also be hate speech and contrary to English law. But it seemed quite strangely that for a debate that was supposed to be open only to members of the union, many members were turned away, and some members of the audience, according to this independent analysis that's been conducted, seem to have no connection to the union or Oxford University at all. So again, to a certain extent, strong indications that the deck had been stacked, particularly for this debate. But the fact that this was possible, permissible, and so easy to achieve on this evening, I think should send a stark warning, because even if this is not reflective of the makeup of the whole student body, it is what this president was able to achieve, even through manipulation, as the case may be, in the context of what has been. I know we've got quite an international audience, and I think it's important for me to be able to get across how significant the Oxford Union's reputation is in the United Kingdom. There was a very famous debate which essentially asked whether or not individuals would fight for king and country. And that was considered to be a very shameful moment in the Union's history when that motion was defeated and the majority indicated that they would not. Now, very soon after that debate, of course, the issue was really put to the test, and one had significant conscription rates and people signing up in order to defend king and country, and it was proven that the vote in the chamber was in fact well, as many political polls perhaps turn out to be, entirely incorrect. There have been some parallels drawn with this debate and this poll. I have to say, I think it was something like 59 against 270 something. I was surprised that we got quite as much support as 59, because I saw what seemed to be 4 other supporters in the room. So if we managed to convince over 50 people, then I would
Yeah.
say that's another strong indication that my fellow speakers and I did very well on the night.
Absolutely, and it makes all the more important that you actually showing up and being there despite facing so much hostility. Because for the students who are undecided, for the people watching it in the wider university, and for the millions who will be watching it online, it is so important to hear your side. So thank you for having the courage to do that. Now let's talk about the meat of not just this debate, but the wider debates that are taking place. Obviously, you're an expert in international law, and we're seeing Israel facing this accusation of genocide. You described it as the greatest blood libel ever. Before we understand your kind of legal defense, how do the accusers even get to a place where they even can attempt to make such an accusation? Can you explain to us the kind of essence of the arguments that we're seeing?
So the way that the accusers get to this point is multifaceted, and it has also been evolving over time. I mean, the allegation against Israel is not a new one. I remember back in 2014 when I first started doing interviews on this subject, and I was on LBC for a sort of 40-minute debate in the studio with Nick Ferrari. My counterpart was using the allegation of genocide even then. That was in the context of the Tzuk Eitan, Operation Protective Edge. So the use of the allegation against Israel is certainly not new. That's over a decade ago. But what is important to note is the pervasiveness of the term's use on this occasion. And that has been achieved because of the very public way in which the key case that South Africa has been brought, has been treated, how it has been covered in the international media. And it's important, perhaps before we go into the meat of the allegations, to understand the motivation behind making this allegation of genocide in a forum like the International Court of Justice. Because South Africa used this allegation, entirely false allegation of genocide, in one sense as a legal hook to bring Israel to the court, because both Israel and South Africa are party to the Genocide Convention, and it is because they are both signatories of this international convention, this treaty, that the court has ultimately jurisdiction in this case. And we can come on to some of the detail as to why that is. So the first reason that it brought that allegation in the context of the International Court of Justice is as a legal hook to bring Israel to the court. But soon after the first provisional measures order in January this year, the provisional measures order was on the 26th of January. I was on SABC, South Africa's version of the BBC, on the 27th of January. And my counterpart, as we were discussing this development, said, "Isn't it wonderful? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence, and nobody can tell us otherwise." And that remark, a throwaway remark as it may have been, really stuck with me and has remained with me since, because it epitomizes exactly what it is that the detractors of Israel, the haters of Jews, are seeking to achieve by alleging this wholly false, unsubstantiatable allegation against Israel. It is to shift the Overton window, the acceptable parameters of debate and discussion here, and to perpetuate. It's important that you reference this being a blood libel. I say it's the greatest blood libel simply when I reflect on other blood libels that have been levied against the Jewish people. This is not a new phenomenon either. You know, what began in the Middle Ages with this canard that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual, that ancient blood libel, I say, is with us today in many modern forms. The general canard of Israel killing Palestinian children or targeting Palestinian children is a general, very, very closely linked modern adaptation of the ancient blood libel, because it involves killing children, and it is entirely false. And we've seen that, of course, also reflected in supposedly respectable print media. One article, if you can believe it, it was even accompanied by fabricated X-rays that showed bullets in brains, which ballistics experts said could never have possibly manifested, given that the heads that were on these X-rays were intact and the bullets seemed to have been superimposed into them, no damage to the skull having been sustained. And nonetheless, supposedly respectable broadsheets are publishing these total canards, these lies. They also bring to mind years ago a Swedish newspaper, Aftonbladet, accused Israel of harvesting the organs of Palestinians. Again, entirely false. And I think that was ultimately retracted, but we've seen that canard being made, being advanced, alleged again and again in more recent months. But the reason I said that genocide was the most egregious and the latest is that I looked at it in the context of all of the terms of international law that are being inverted and used against Israel, where the victims of these crimes are being accused of perpetrating them. And we see that across all of these pseudo-legal terms that are being used essentially to shut people up, because the automatic reaction response is, oh goodness, I don't know enough about international law to be able to challenge this or push back on this. And I see it time and time again where these falsehoods about international law are being propagated, and they are unchallenged because people don't feel they have the tools to do so properly. And so this chain of legal terminology and this chain of blood libels, which includes occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and now genocide, does in many, many ways get progressively worse. It's the lies have to become more and more extreme. And I think that the key reason that so many detractors of Israel, those that are seeking to delegitimize it, vilify the Jewish state, are able to get away with it is because they are cloaking these false allegations in this legal terminology in pseudo-international law. The reason I say that they are entirely inverted is that the real victims of each of these allegations have been the Jewish people, especially those in the State of Israel. This concept of occupation. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, and this goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with colonialism, this is what the British mandate was for the indigenous Jewish population of Judea. And the notion that Israel would be accused of colonialism is ludicrous when we consider that Israel is the most successful decolonization story. We see this with ethnic cleansing, which essentially papers over the Jewish experience of ethnic cleansing. We only need to look at, after the State of Israel even, the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria by Jordan in its occupation from 1949 to 1967, the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem, from the old city of Jerusalem, by the Jordanians across that same period of their illegal, if you will, occupation. The ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world, 850,000 expelled from Arab countries, so that so much of the Arab world now is Jew-free. That is the real ethnic cleansing, and yet Israel is being the one accused of it. The same goes for apartheid. There is apartheid in the region, in the disputed territories, because in the West Bank, after the Oslo Accords, we have the Palestinian Authority as an autonomy, self-determination for the Palestinians in areas A and B of the West Bank. I was there last week looking at areas A and B from Area C. I couldn't go in to A or B. There were big red signs that warn any Israeli citizens from entering these places. And they don't really mean Israeli citizens, because I saw Israeli vehicles going in and out. Arab Israelis don't have any problem traveling in and out of these areas. What they mean is Jews. And the reason that these areas are apartheid areas free of Jews at the behest of the Palestinian leadership is that Jews aren't safe. We saw this in 2000 when two army reservists got lost. I think they were relying on a sat nav, and they ended up in Ramallah, which is relatively easy to do if you're traveling in the West Bank and you're not paying attention, because each of these areas is so close together. That's one thing that I think people who probably haven't visited these areas understand how tiny this part of the world is, and how areas A, B, and C are so close, and how the communities there live cheek by jowl. These two reservists ended up in Ramallah by mistake, and they sought help from the local police station. And it was there that they were lynched. And there's a very famous image of one of the attackers holding up his bloodied hands to the window, and the crowd below was cheering and yelling, and seems very reminiscent actually of the 7th of October. But this was all the way back in 2000. So it's very clear that Jews cannot be in Palestinian-controlled territory in areas A and B. It's clear that they cannot be in Palestinian-controlled territory in the Gaza Strip. Again, ethnically cleansing the Jews in 2005 when Israel withdrew. So this is all in lead up to why it is I say that once we've gone through occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and we come to the question of genocide, genocide is this latest canard. And it is the most egregious because, again, it is accusing the Jews of perpetrating the very crimes that were committed against them. I don't just mean the genocide of the Holocaust, which is what gave rise to this term. This was coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish jurist, who was trying to find legal terminology for the Jewish experience of being targeted for extermination because they were Jews. And he coined the term genocide. I don't just mean the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, I also mean the acts of genocide that were perpetrated again against Jews on the 7th of October, because Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist organizations made it perfectly plain what their intention was when they killed, slaughtered, raped, mutilated, tortured, and kidnapped. They were targeting Jews because they were Jews. And we can come on to the definition of genocide, but that satisfies it. So when you step back and you take into account, the reasons that this is being deployed for delegitimization purposes, for shifting the Overton window, changing the rules of the debate, and the real moral repugnance of this particular allegation being alleged against Israel, I hope that puts it into a little bit of perspective. But I think the reason it's been so successful is ultimately, despite having no basis in reality whatsoever, must ultimately come down to the fact that it is tapping into the oldest hatred, and it is so pervasive now in the media that it is being discussed in these terms that you repeat a lie enough times and it starts to be believed by more and more people.
What piece of evidence do they even try to utilize to make the accusation? Like, how are they attempting to make such a claim when it seems to just not reflect the reality?
So a couple of things here. When South Africa originally brought the application against Israel, they focused on the intention aspect of it. So the crime of genocide, which is defined in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, focuses in the first part of the definition on an intention to eradicate a group, an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group, as such, in whole or in part. So it's all about having an intention to target people because of the group that they belong to, with an intention to eradicate part of that group, as such, because it is that group. And then the definition lists a number of acts, including killing or creating conditions that make life impossible. And so what South Africa did when it first brought this application is it quoted a number of Israeli politicians, I should say misquoted, and put the translation into a totally false context. So, for example, it talked about the calls to combat or get rid of Amalek. It talked about targeting, well, these were statements by politicians calling for the destruction of Hamas. And the South African legal team presented it to the court as though this was Israeli politicians calling for the destruction of the Palestinian people. So that was the major misrepresentation, but the key factual, evidential basis, false factual, false evidential basis, but the one that was being put forward. Since then, South Africa has put in a substantial amount of material. I mean, again, as a kind of PR exercise for the cameras, they rocked up outside of the court with a van, which was filled to the top with lever arch files, which they were delivering to the court. This is their evidence. Why they didn't do so electronically, as certainly all the submissions I've made to the court have been sent. Well, it wouldn't be quite as dramatic for the cameras. We don't know what is in those memorials, but there are a number of other organisations that have made similar allegations who have sought to put forward material evidence. One recent such organisation was Amnesty International, which released a report accusing Israel of genocide. It's important to note that in that report, Amnesty actually tried to redefine what genocide is. So there's a lot of important case law about genocide. It being such an extreme issue, it's the crime of crimes. The case law also coming from Eastern Europe indicates that genocide must be the only plausible inference to draw from a situation. So in a situation where you've got, an armed conflict and there are alternative explanations, the level of evidence really does have to be significant to be able to successfully allege genocide. Amnesty International don't like that because it makes it even harder for them to seek to advance these false allegations against Israel. So they said, no, you need to step back and you need to look at the whole of the context. And what do they mean by the context, Ollie? It's not the 7th of October. Because in fact, they begin this report by saying the first opening line is Israel's assault on Gaza began on the 7th of October, which you and I both know is completely fanciful, because it wasn't until several days later that Israel began, once it had cleared Israeli territory the kibbutzim and mishavim in the south of Israel of Hamas terrorists. That took a number of days before they could begin to contemplate the attempted rescue missions for the hostages and the counter attack on Hamas. So it's not the 7th of October that Amnesty have claimed is relevant to a redefinition of genocide, but what they call the occupation, which we can come on to why that is a false legal term also to be deploying here. So we've had that example in the context of Amnesty's report. There is a report, I'm not sure if it's fully out yet, but it has been, at least there was an embargoed report which has been leaked to the media, where Human Rights Watch in the last couple of days has made a similar allegation, and they have said that they believe the crime of extermination and genocide is made out because Israel has restricted water to the Gaza Strip. That is also palpably false. And in fact, COGAT, which is the unit of the IDF that is responsible for the provision of humanitarian assistance in times of armed conflict, today tweeted in response to that baseless accusation, detail on the level of the millions of cubic meters, or however it is that you measure water, that has been provided via Israel through 3 water pipes into Gaza through Israeli territory. Some of which were attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October. So Israel has repaired those pipes and other water installations and continued to supply the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. Also Hamas. We can't avoid the fact that when Israel provides water, humanitarian assistance, food aid into the Gaza Strip, much of it, unfortunately, is diverted to Hamas, but Israel provides it anyway because it takes its humanitarian responsibilities very seriously. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavour of some of the basis allegations. And of course, the big one, which I've left till last, is what we're seeing on our television screens. Don't underestimate the power of these images. And they will no doubt get worse as and when international media gets into the Gaza Strip in greater numbers. I was there in September on the ground. I went in with the 162nd Division of the IDF. I was there a couple of days after they recovered the bodies of the 6 hostages that were murdered in cold blood by Hamas in the tunnels. And I saw with my own eyes the reality. There is significant destruction, not least because Hamas has booby-trapped. I went into Rafah, where they had booby-trapped every civilian house in the hope of killing Israeli soldiers as they went in to clear these houses. Those explosives would then be set off. And in fact, I saw that Hamas had put cameras in these houses, which it was monitoring from tunnels below them, so that it could tell when soldiers were entering them and detonate that remotely. So Israel was alive to this, the IDF was alive to this, and instead of sending soldiers into these houses to clear them, it often swept them with drones. That's how we could see an awful lot of what was within these buildings, including the cameras and the explosive devices that had been set up. And where they were discovered, these booby-trapped buildings had to be destroyed. That is the only way to be able to render that area safe. So the level of destruction from that phenomenon, from the fact that Hamas embedded its terror infrastructure in every single mosque, school, hospital, clinic, and was using every second house as part of its terror infrastructure, either as command and control centers, or as weapons depots, or as rocket launch sites, or as hideouts, or as tunnel coverings for tunnel openings. And this is the reality, but what we see on the international media is ultimately purely Hamas propaganda. Why? Because no media operates in Gaza without Hamas control. And actually, it is such an indictment on any journalist with integrity, on the BBC, on any news agency that is reporting from the Gaza Strip and that fails to provide a health warning. If they were reporting from North Korea, any responsible, respectable journalist would indicate as part of their broadcast that they were unable to freely report given the controls of the local authorities. That is the same case in Gaza, and they do not do so. Now, I'll just give you, I know it's a very long answer, I'll just give you one brief anecdote, if I may. I was in Israel the last couple of weeks, and I went to do a couple of shows with Douglas Murray in Tel Aviv, and he had very recently been in Lebanon. He had been embedded with the IDF there. The IDF was able to facilitate an embed with journalists in Lebanon in the south, just by the Israeli northern border, in a way that they haven't been able to with respect to the IDF in the Gaza Strip, because the security situation is so very different. And, Douglas was talking to his fellow journalists, and he mentioned, as part of our discussion in the Save the West tour, that they had remarked, the other journalists that he was embedded with, that they had to be very careful about what they reported because of their colleagues in Beirut and what Hezbollah would do to these colleagues if they reported the wrong thing. It is an absolute, utterly shameful, I clearly don't have the words for it, disgrace that the international community serves as Hamas mouthpiece and is misinforming the international public. But this is essentially forming the basis of the allegation of genocide, the false allegation, the destruction that you see, the false Hamas propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so interesting as well to think about the fact that, as you listed, every accusation from apartheid to colonization to genocide, how I think it was Douglas actually who picked up on that Vasily Grossman quote of "they are what they accuse you of," and I didn't actually consider also the fact that much of the destruction that the media are soon going to become aware of in Gaza in terms of the building destruction, that is quite literally something self-inflicted by Hamas, which they then point the finger at Israel for. But because of all this booby trapping, because of their attack on October 7th, I think that has to be one of the key messages that needs to be given across, that this is self-inflicted. All the suffering that we're seeing, it's self-inflicted by Hamas and the leadership and the choices that they've made. One final question, because I want to get to audience questions. Please do type your questions in the Q&A chat box, and I'll potentially pick up on it and ask Natasha. But one thing I wanted to ask you, just briefly, if possible, could you give us a bit more of a sense and the terms we can utilize in terms of how help us understand, how does international law account for armies dealing with an enemy operating out of civilian areas?
So not particularly well, it has to be said. The laws of war were originally conceived in a context where one army was fighting another on an open battlefield. They were essentially wearing uniform, identifying themselves, that this is how responsible armies are meant to conduct themselves, to distinguish between the combatants and civilians on their side and the combatants and civilians on the other side. And so an awful lot of the laws of war are predicated on the fact that you've got two responsible armies, two states, as it were, fighting according to the rules. And where you have asymmetric warfare, where you have non-state actors, and in this case, terror armies, which is what Israel has been facing in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah, their tactics, their modus operandi, almost their raison d'etre, is to violate the rules of law, of war, and use the other side's compliance with international humanitarian law to their own advantage. So that's why they embed themselves in mosque schools and hospitals, because they know Israel is going to be reluctant to deal with the military installations that these entities have become. They're no longer civilian or protected infrastructure when they are being used as Hamas command and control centers. They become legitimate military targets. But they know that when Israel lawfully hits that target, the international media is going to scream about Israel hitting a hospital. Sometimes the international media scream about Israel hitting a hospital when it hasn't hit a hospital. When it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that hits the car park of a hospital, Israel still blamed for apparently 500 deaths, which were entirely fabricated in the context of the Al-Ahli hospital. I believe that was the 23rd of October last year. I still don't think there's been an apology forthcoming from the BBC from that. Not to just focus on the BBC, others reported it, but I think they were amongst the first to falsely report those developments. And Jeremy Bowen said he didn't regret that reporting at all. So that is a significant factor to bear in mind, that modern law-abiding militaries are having to deal with extremely challenging situations where the laws of war are being deliberately used against them. Nonetheless, it is perfectly legitimate to target terrorist infrastructure, and to do so in accordance with the laws of war. 3 or 4, let's say, key principles that law-abiding states have to comply with. The first is military necessity. You must only strike targets that are militarily necessary to advance your military aims, your goals. This is what Israel has been doing in Gaza. Its goals have been to defeat Hamas, to prevent it from ever controlling Gaza politically, militarily again, and to release the hostages. And every measure that it has taken was necessary in order to advance those legitimate goals. That's the first principle, military necessity. The second is distinction, which is what I mentioned. It means that you distinguish between civilians and combatants, and you target the combatants and you avoid the civilians wherever possible. The third is proportionality. That is perhaps the most misrepresented element of international law ever. Proportionality is not about comparing casualty figures. That would be macabre. It would also encourage Hamas simply to continue driving up the casualty count and using human shields. Proportionality requires that a military commander conduct a balancing exercise and weigh up the anticipated civilian or collateral damage against the expected military advantage of a strike. Military advantage that is direct and concrete. Now, what that equation tells you is two things. First, civilian casualties are a given in armed conflict. International humanitarian law requires responsible armies to keep them as low as possible. But they are going to happen. There's never been a conflict in history where civilians haven't died. We'll come on to perhaps talk about ratios in this case, but the ratio between civilians and combatants here is incomparable with any other urban armed conflict in history. Israel is record-breaking in its ability to target terrorists and avoid civilian casualties. So the first thing that the proportionality principle tells you is civilians are going to die. That's inevitable. It's a tragic reality of war. But the second thing that it tells you is that it's the military commander that is making this assessment on a strike-by-strike basis, on the basis of the intelligence that he or she has, and on the advice of military lawyers. And that is on the basis of what they know about the military necessity and the concrete military advantage that will be gained by a strike, and what they know about the anticipated civilian or collateral damage. No one who is not in possession of that information and that balancing exercise, that analysis, can possibly make an assessment as to whether a strike was proportional or disproportionate. So any time you hear military analysts, journalists, lawyers or pseudo-lawyers that opine that Israel's conduct in Gaza has been in some way disproportionate, know that they have no basis of making that assumption, that assessment whatsoever. The countries that have been provided with this information, with detailed information and analysis on Israel's targeting and proportionality analysis, the UK and the US included, have been consistent in their public assessment that Israel is complying with international humanitarian law throughout this conflict. And I think that's extremely telling. Completely contrary to what politicians, some of them, and international media are opining and espousing. And the last principle, because I said there were 4, is the principle of precaution. And that requires that a moral army, that a law-abiding army, keep civilian casualties as low as possible through taking measures that are exercising precaution. For example, again, Israel is conducting itself in a way that is unprecedented in the history of armed conflict in terms of the warnings that it gives before it strikes terrorist infrastructure, the ability that it has demonstrated to evacuate civilians from areas that it is intending to strike through creating humanitarian corridors, through defending those humanitarian corridors and the civilians utilizing them from Hamas fire, because Hamas has been firing on its own civilians as they are seeking to flee these areas. The warnings that Israel provides also by text message, by phone call to individual householders, by leaflets, all of those, as well as the measures that Israel takes to call off strikes if for some reason the proportionality analysis changes, or if it gets new intelligence that indicates that there were more civilians there than it anticipated, that the analysis has to be redone. So it's the principle of precaution, which is the 4th principle I would raise. And that's the framework of the law of armed conflict. And it's important to just address that even though it is unbelievably challenging to comply with IHL, in circumstances where your enemy is seeking to utilize it so cynically and so viciously in terms of the civilians that are suffering because of it against you, it is all the more laudable that Israel has been able to set these new standards in the way that it conducts armed conflict, and in fact set standards for itself which are far in excess of what the law of armed conflict requires.
Yeah, yeah. And I always say when people talk about proportionality and numbers, I say my view is, and I think actually from certainly a Jewish morality perspective, proportionality should mean proportionate to delivering peace, long-term peace. And that should be the way it's looked at. But I now want to get to some questions from the audience because there's a lot, and I'll try to get through as many as we can. I've asked Trudy, who runs lockdown, for permission to extend till 1:15 because I think there's quite a lot of interest in this discussion. I'll start off with a question from Hillel Schenker, who said, of course, Israel itself is not an apartheid state, but wouldn't you agree that the situation in the West Bank is very apartheid-like, with a discriminatory dual legal system, one for the settlers with full rights as Israelis, and a second for the Palestinians who are denied equal rights? And before you give your answer, I would also note that last year I produced a film that's on YouTube, a documentary called Settling the Facts, which talks all about these issues of the settlements. And Natasha features in it quite heavily. So you can, there we go into, it's nearly an hour and a half. The film goes into the legal issues, the moral questions, the human face of who these people are. Yeah, that's just for a lengthier discussion. But Natasha, if you want to address Hillel's question.
Yes, of course. The answer is no, because the premise of the question fails to acknowledge the existence of the Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank. I mentioned Palestinian self-governance over areas A and B. And so the Palestinians have representation within that self-governing unit. They should be voting for their leadership. Yes, Mahmoud Abbas is in the 19th year of his 4-year term. Yes, Fatah, the ruling party, is immensely corrupt, and they are constantly under challenge by Hamas, that seeks to violently take over those areas of the West Bank in the same way they took over the Gaza Strip. But Israel does not control those areas, so it has no hand in what the Palestinians are doing in terms of their self-governance. It's important that we don't infantilize the Palestinians, and we acknowledge and recognize that they were given autonomy under the auspices of the international community and the Oslo Accords. Now, Israel does not rule over these people. It remained in Area C. It has maintained full civilian and security control over those areas. And that area is administered in accordance with a temporary administrative framework, which Israel instituted in 1967. And it is under that framework, which incorporated aspects of the laws of occupation, but that doesn't mean that the territory is occupied. That's an important distinction to make, and it is one that has been universally misrepresented. But it is because Israel applied that temporary framework to that territory that it is mandated under international law to have military courts in operation in that territory. This is what gives rise to this allegation of a dual legal system. But again, it's not an allegation that is reflective of the reality, because Israeli citizens in that territory are subject to Israeli law there as they are anywhere in the world. Non-Israeli citizens are not subject to Israeli law, and I say because of the international legal framework that has been applied, are by mandate, by international law requirement, subject to military courts. They cannot be subject to Israeli courts and the Israeli legal system. I mean, if they were, I'm sure there would be equally as many people making allegations that that was some sort of two-tier system. So in many respects, Israel can't possibly win. But it is important to understand how misrepresentative this suggestion is. There's also this absolutely false suggestion that there are Jew-only roads. I mean, I was on one of them earlier last week when I drove through Samaria, but it is not a Jew-only road. There are certain roads that are restricted to Israeli citizens, Arabs, and Jews, Muslims, Christians, all of them use it because they are roads on which there have been numerous attacks, shooting attacks, and other explosive attacks on civilians. And so, for security reasons, and given that these roads lead in no way to Palestinian towns, Arab towns, so there is no reason for a non-Israeli citizen to be on them, that is a measure that has been put in place as part of the security restrictions in those territories. But again, you see an awful lot of these misrepresentations, and it is only through these misrepresentations that these false allegations of apartheid or differences or the way that these people are being treated can be maintained. Every state treats its citizens differently to non-citizens. If an Israeli travelled here to the UK, he or she would not have the same rights as you or I, as British citizens. That is entirely legitimate everywhere else in the world, it seems, apart from Israel. And so that is another, manifest double standard that is being applied here. But it is justified, it seems, by this falsehood that Israel is ruling over these people and taking out the Palestinian self-governance, the Palestinian autonomy entirely from the equation.
Louise and Quentin Crivon ask, they say, I had the pleasure of meeting Natasha in Dublin, Ireland, when she gave such an impressive presentation to Irish, Jewish, and non-Jews supporters of Israel. Perhaps Natasha would like to address the latest anti-Israel attitude of the Irish president and government, which firstly resulting in the withdrawal of Israel's ambassador, and now the closing of the embassy. As the last Irish Jewish GP solicitor, now retired, I must say that I'm very sad to call myself Irish, notwithstanding I've now taken up residence in the UK.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear about the personal circumstances around this question. I very much enjoyed a number of opportunities that I had to travel to Ireland, Dublin in particular, to speak about these issues. My last trip was just over a year ago when I, in fact, did a debate at University College Dublin. And I have to say, I know we began this discussion about my experience at the Oxford Union. Ollie, that paled into insignificance next to the fact that I had to be bundled out of the debating chamber by security as a brawl broke out when members who had come to watch the debate, also dressed in kaffirs, stood up, started screaming Allahu Akbar and vowing that the 7th of October would happen again and again, and attacked Jews who were there in the audience. So the situation in Ireland has been deteriorating for some time, and over a number of years attending events and speaking there, I have seen that deterioration. And I'm afraid to say over a number of ambassadors from Israel to Ireland that I've had the great pleasure to get to know, including Dana Ehrlich most recently, and I know that she has done a sterling job in seeking to navigate that very difficult territory and the extremely hostile environment. It's my understanding that the decision to withdraw the embassy was taken essentially after a series of extremely problematic developments, not least Ireland deciding to recognise the so-called state of Palestine. It is not a state. Under international law, there are recognized criteria under the Montevideo Convention for statehood, which the Palestinian Authority does not meet. So this was a political recognition, I'd say without legal ramifications, without legal basis, but nonetheless, what a disgusting move, a purported reward for the 7th of October atrocities. Ireland had certainly pinned its colours to the mast in that respect. But the most recent development was it purporting to intervene in the case that South Africa has brought against Israel, and without shame, without any element of shame, because it stated this in the press release that it made, it was making this intervention in order to seek to broaden the definition of genocide. I mentioned Amnesty International's attempts to manipulate and rewrite the definition of genocide in its most recent report, while Ireland is seeking to do so, weaponize international law, entirely misrepresent international law in this very disturbing context. So I can understand Israel's decision. I think this should be of concern not just to Israel, but Ireland's actions and the deeply anti Semitic undertones to them ought to be of concern to all law abiding citizens around the world and all those states that prize the rule of law, because Ireland has made it clear that it is willing to weaponize international law for the purpose of targeting Israel.
Yeah, when I saw that they said they proposed expanding the definition of genocide,
Yeah.
to me, this is classic anti-Semitism. In fact, I would go so far as to say, we speak about they are what they accuse you of. In some ways, I think this makes Ireland complicit in a genocide, actually, Hamas's genocide, because Hamas are trying to genocide the Jews. Israel's trying to stop that threat. They've realized that Israel's not committing genocide in response. And so now they try to expand the definition and change the legal system in order to undermine Israel's attempt to get rid of these genociders. So in that sense, I think they are complicit in genocide. I
Well,
want to get to
Hamas has welcomed this intervention, of course, every step of the way, and that in the same way that it welcomed South Africa bringing this case in the first instance. And when an internationally prescribed terrorist organization is thanking and congratulating a state for the actions that it is taking, it's perhaps incumbent on that state to take a step back and wonder if it's in fact on the right side of history here.
Exactly. Eve Weinberg said, I understand that you submitted a dossier on behalf of UK Lawyers for Israel to the International Court of Justice, pointing out the errors in the case against Israel, and that Karim Khan told the three judges to ignore all these submissions. And so the warrants were issued. What can be done in such cases where people/organizations in positions of power refuse to be impartial and just press on with their own agenda if they won't accept the facts?
Well, let me just first clarify that the dossier or the submission that's being referred to was to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which also sits in The Hague. Although we have made separate submissions to the International Court of Justice, which has considered other anti-Israel initiatives. But just focusing on the ICC, which deals with individual criminal responsibility first, it's absolutely right. We made a submission to the court on the total lack of accuracy of the information that had been put before pre-trial chamber one when it was asked to determine the issuance of these warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, against Yoav Gallant, and also against a dead man, Mohammed Daif. They threw that in for good measure in some pursuit or attempt at balance, supposedly. The response of the prosecutor, both to the submission, but also to a piece of correspondence that was sent directly to him and to the court, which set out chapter and verse with footnotes to publicly available open source material that demonstrated that every phrase of every sentence of his public summary of his warrants application was false. It's right to say that his response to that was to tell the court, ignore any submissions on accuracy that don't come from me. That is what prompted my organisation, UK Lawyers for Israel, also to make a professional complaint against him to the Bar Standards Board. It is my professional regulator also. Barristers have professional duties to the court. In this instance, where what Karim Khan was making is what's called an ex parte application. It is made without the other side being present, without the other side being able to challenge the material he's putting before the court. There is even more onus on him as prosecutor to present any contradictory or exculpatory evidence. Not only did he not do so, but when he was put on notice of the utter falsities that he had put before the court, he did not take the opportunity to review, and he simply told the court to proceed. So these warrants have ultimately been issued by a court that was misled, that they have been issued on the basis of this entirely false information. Just to give you one example of this, because the focus of these allegations has been this canard of starvation, Karim Khan based his warrants application on a report from the IPC in the spring of this year that suggested that famine could come to parts of Gaza. Well, that report was entirely debunked by the Famine Review Committee subsequently, that indicated the conclusions that it drew were implausible, that also revealed that it had been based on only partial information. Inter alia, it had not taken into account aid that was going into the Gaza Strip from private sources. But in any event, all of this information is shown to be utterly false, simply by reference to the figures of aid that have been going into the Gaza Strip. Provided again by COGAT, this unit of the IDF that I mentioned. They provide weekly updates as to the volume of aid that is being facilitated into Gaza, and on average, it has been in excess of 3,000 calories, in the region of 3,200 calories per day per Gazan that has been facilitated into the Gaza Strip over the year, October to October. Now, that is significantly in excess of the guidance for the provision, the calorific provision in armed conflict. It is also, I'm sure as many of our listeners, watchers will recognise, significantly in excess of NHS guidelines. Whether or not this aid is in fact reaching the civilians that need it is a very valid question, and ultimately the international community has an awful lot to answer for permitting Hamas to continue to steal, divert this aid, sell it off at inflated prices. We also know instances of Hamas shooting civilians that are seeking to access this aid. All of that is an important part of the equation, none of which has entered into the court's analysis at all, of course. But the very basic allegations that have been levelled are rendered entirely false simply by reference to the volume of aid that has been going in, facilitated by Israel, and, as I say, this publicly available information. What is the recourse? That is a very important question, because the prosecutor refused to engage with this and told the court to ignore it. The court has plainly not engaged with this. And not only that, it has at every juncture kicked the can down the road on objections to the absence of the court's jurisdiction here, because let me be frank, it has none. Israel is not a party to the ICC. The Palestinians are also not able to be party because they are not a state. Jurisdiction has to be delegated to the court by a state that has jurisdiction. None of that applies here. So in every sense, the rules are being thrown out of the window. The facts are being completely made up. And there is no mechanism, it seems, within the court that is willing to take this into account and willing to deal with this. And therefore, it is up to member states of the ICC to call out this court that has now become this politicized, weaponized political body, no longer a court, but also non-states parties. And the United States has been very robust in the rhetoric that it has deployed against the court. There is every expectation that the next administration will re-implement the sanctions that they had placed on the previous prosecutor and her officials, Fatou Bensouda, when she originally opened this investigation into Israel, despite having no jurisdiction to do so. So I think it's important that outside entities call this court to account, reveal the fact that it is no longer conducting itself as a court of law, and apply sanctions and pressure. Ultimately, if that's not successful, essentially seek to take this court apart. Because if it is no longer applying international law, if it is no longer in pursuit of international criminal justice, then it is a danger to the international legal order. And that is something that ought to concern, as I say, not just member states of the ICC, but also all of those states that are not members that still prize international rule of law.
Well, this touches on Ron Gotkin's question, who said, do you think there's any chance at all, when the court finally rules on the genocide issue, that they will exonerate Israel? Are the odds too stacked?
So I think I always thought from the beginning that there was a significant chance that this was the case. And that is why South Africa was putting all of its eggs in the provisional measures baskets, and everything to do with the PR campaign and the drama that it was seeking to eke out, including misrepresenting what these provisional measures orders had said. So, for example, I'm sure everyone will be familiar with this false reporting that the ICJ had found Israel plausibly guilty of genocide, or that there was a plausible risk of genocide. I mean, all of that was untrue. The court hasn't considered the merits in this case at all. All that the court found was that the case that South Africa brought plausibly raised rights that fell under the Genocide Convention. Plausible rights, that's the terminology that the court uses. So it was my distinct impression, also because South Africa were really dragging their feet here. They kept asking for delays and extensions, and they didn't really want to get to the merit stage because they were getting so much publicity out of the false reporting and the false information before the court had actually determined anything. That all of that indicated to me very strongly that even South Africa didn't think that it had any case to run here. Having said that, when we look at where the ICJ has moved to since the retiring of the previous head, the president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, she gave an interview on Hard Talk, in fact, after her retirement on the BBC, where she called out the reporting and the false reporting of the first provisional measures order, and ultimately, finally, thankfully, vindicated everything some of us had been saying for 5 months before that. But since her retirement, she has been succeeded by the current president, Judge Salem, who has a vicious anti-Israel track record. He was previously Lebanon's ambassador to the UN, where he called Israel a terrorist state and accused Israel of war crimes. I mean, in any court of law, actual court of law, he would be required to recuse himself. But here, he has been driving this forward at speed. And when we see the advisory opinion that he presided over, which came out in the summer, just before the September UN General Assembly sessions, which called for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria and from East Jerusalem, and actually wiped Israel off of the map, because in it, he, in the majority opinion, referred to Palestinian territory as contiguous. I mean, either they don't recognize Israel, or they actually didn't look at a map. But in any event, it doesn't speak particularly well of the judges presiding over that case, which are the same judges that will be determining the case that South Africa has brought against Israel and these false allegations. So whereas at the start of this process, I was relatively confident, I think now even I have had to come to terms with the fact that this is a court, the International Court of Justice, also, like the ICC, no longer operating as a court of law, which absolutely cannot be trusted to deal with this case in any way, in a just, judicious manner. And in light of the kind of public sentiment and the media coverage, and so many judges, even when they are commentating on this, essentially basing their assessment on what they are seeing on television. And this comes back to the media coverage that I spoke to earlier, that is simply Hamas propaganda, because that's all that's coming out of the Gaza Strip. When one takes all of that into account, then I'm afraid I think we have to be prepared for this court simply endorsing this modern blood libel against the state of Israel.
Well, Natasha, we're going to have to wrap up in a minute, but one more question that I just have, I'm sure many people are curious to know, is what are you focused on in terms of your projects moving forward?
Wow, we're going to be here a little while if I go through all of them, but perhaps I can give you a couple of highlights. I mean, one key issue is UNRWA, the UN organization that is responsible for perpetuating and propagating this conflict through its indoctrination of Palestinian children from kindergarten up, to believe that the highest calling in life is martyrdom and to slaughter as many Jews as possible, to the perpetuation of this unique concept of Palestinian refugee status, which is at the core of what is so misdescribed as this right of return, a euphemism, of course, for the destruction of the state of Israel. So grappling with UNRWA's complicity in terrorism, of course, it's the UNRWA employees being involved in the 7th of October massacres, holding hostages, covering up Hamas command centers, providing electricity to the data center that Hamas was operating under, the UNRWA headquarters. I mean, all of this, which has just been ignored by Antonio Guterres, by Philippe Lazzarini, the head of UNRWA, that really has to be dealt with. And I know that there are initiatives to contend with the supposed immunity that UNRWA has as an international organization under the auspices of the UN. So UNRWA is a big matter, certainly following what is going to come out of the ICC, ensuring that the issues of immunity for the head of government, Netanyahu, is understood and respected around the world, ensuring, of course, that the next administration in the United States is properly briefed on all of these international legal developments, and making sure that responsible states around the world understand the consequences of the weaponization of these international courts and tribunals, and the consequences of that for the rule of law more broadly. But of course, we've also got big fights against anti-Semitism at home, be it the policing of these pro-terror hate marches that are encouraging attacks on Jews, the appalling coverage that we've seen of the conflict through the BBC and others that might be subject to challenge. So, you name it, there are legal matters to address across the board. I'm so privileged to be part of and be involved with this incredible and inspirational group of lawyers at UK Lawyers for Israel. We are inundated, and we do have more work than resources allow us to grapple with. So I hope people will be patient with us, but we are desperately keen to be able to assist wherever possible, and so people,
and support you as well. I hope people will support you,
and that too. that would be certainly very welcome, because we'd love to be able to expand to address these challenges, which are only going to grow. This has been referred to so frequently now as the Eighth Front. Israel's fighting 7 fronts militarily, but the Eighth Front is in the international legal arena. It is in the context of lawfare. I am certainly focusing on a great deal of that in the international law context, but it will be at domestic level before too long, and we're preparing for those battles also.
Well, you've got a lot on your plate, Natasha, but I would just like to finish by expressing, I'm sure on behalf of everyone watching, and just more generally the pro-Israel world, just a great deal of gratitude to you for your courage, eloquence, and moral clarity. It is so valuable right now in a truth deprived world. We so need your voice. So thank you for everything you do. Thank you to everyone for watching. I think we're gonna wrap it up here.
I appreciate that, Ollie. Thanks ever so much.
If you appreciate what we're doing at JTV to share the truth about Israel and create positive associations with the Jewish people and Judaism, I want to tell you something. We are reaching millions every single week across the world, non-Jews and Jews alike. And we have a plan to grow the channel, to accelerate our growth with more presenters and documentaries. And we've launched a campaign in order to make this possible. Have a watch. The world is full of lies.
That Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu bear criminal responsibility.
The truth is under attack.
Which river, which sea? So you don't know that.
From the media to the UN to celebrities, lies reign supreme. But the thing about the truth is that no matter how dark a room of lies, if you light one candle of truth, it can light up the whole room. That's why I created JTV, the global Jewish YouTube channel. We have been lighting the flame of truth on social media. We believe that the key to defeating anti-Semitism isn't just in fighting the hate, but it's about creating pro-Semitism and sharing the truth. There's nothing inevitable about anti-Semitism. We just need to tell our story with confidence, pride, and love. We believe that telling the truth, exposing the lies, and sharing the wisdom and beauty found within the Jewish story and the ideas of Judaism can transform the world. We're reaching millions of people all around the world from all backgrounds and perspectives. Every day we are transforming people's views about Israel, Jews, and Judaism. How do we know? Because they tell us. But there's so much more we can do. It's time for us to build a team to accelerate our growth and produce way more content that can appeal to even more people. We want to hire more presenters, start doing documentary series, and way more. And if we do that, JTV will start competing with the other big media players who peddle anti-Israel narratives. And that's where you come in. I'm asking you to please partner with us on our journey to spread the truth to the entire world. by donating whatever you can to this fundraiser. Together, we will harness the power of social media to shine the light of truth to the whole world. Thank you so much for your support. So we are nearly at our target, and I would be so thrilled if you were able to help us meet it, to partner with us in spreading and sharing the truth to a world that really needs it. You'll partner with us in expanding this channel so we can be even bigger than the voices of hate and lies out there. So please do click on the link in the video description. We're just going to extend the campaign just by a little bit to help us meet our goal and really accelerate our growth. Please be one of those people that doesn't just watch and share and like, that actually chips in to help us accelerate the impact that we are having. We're reaching millions each week, but why don't we reach billions? So much more that we can do together. Thank you so much. Please click on that link in the video description and let's grow this channel together. Thank you.